All right, everybody. We are in for a treat that I think, honest to goodness, was like a year and change in making because we all know I am a joyful, burning dumpster fire of awesomeness. And so sometimes it takes a little while for the stars to align. But here we are, and I have none other than the John with SimplyThick. And I mean, we met years ago, but honestly, what has meant more to me over the last couple of years of knowing him is watching how deeply and immensely he loves his family, his wife, and his kids, and how, yes, he's out there talking all things IDDSI, but when you get to know him, the first thing he does is check in on your village and your family. So, John, thank you for coming on.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and that's a very kind introduction.
Yeah. Well, when you post pictures of your kids, because they're like stair stepped ahead of the boys, I'm like, all right, we're going to survive this stage. It's going to be okay. So,
Yep,
yes.
yep.
Yes. Okay. So you and I met, I want to say at ASHA a couple years ago, and then have run into each other in joyful circles of all things swallowing and swallowing disorders, and then get again at Embasla in this past April. But people can find you kind of all over. Behind the scenes, I reference you as Mr. IDSI. And so I don't know because he's normally wearing his IDSI button-up shirt, and he's got an amazing TikTok account. The Tick of the Talk, that's what my boys and
Yes,
I
tick of
call
the
it.
dock. Yep.
The Tick of the Talk. But it's it has been absolutely delightful to see you take something that can be scary, like thickening, and make it fun. And also, your setup with the cameras is dynamic. So, first, let's take it all the way back to the beginning. Please tell us who you are and how you became Mr. Itzy.
Oh my, how much time do you have? So I am John Holahan. I have a bachelor's of science in something called paper science and engineering, which nobody's ever heard of. It's a tiny program, and even though I was in a very big university, even the university people didn't really know about it. It was the type of degree where when everybody graduated, we all got a job. With the asterisk being in 1992 when I graduated, there was a recession in the paper industry. So not all the paper
Oh,
science people were hired. And so I didn't really have a job, and I eventually got hired by a supplier to the paper industry who happened to be the world's largest xanthan gum manufacturer, among other things. And I was their expert in paper manufacturing with a college degree. So what they really did is they hired me to train me to become an expert and a technical service person. So
okay.
I was the person when you said no to these questions. Is it oil field? Is it pharmaceutical? Is it food? Is it personal care? If you said no to all of those, you were my customer and I had to answer your questions. So I became very well versed in what the chemistry of the thickeners we had. And I became very good at talking to different people in different applications because I never knew what was going to ring on the phone. It could be a paper manufacturer, it could be a carpet printer, it could be a cleaner manufacturer. I just never knew. So I became very comfortable talking in different industries about the applications of these products.
Mhm.
And then, we got bought by Monsanto. I got relocated to St. Louis.
Wait,
And
Monsanto, aren't they the corn people?
primarily what they're known for is GMO
Pesticide.
crops and
Yes.
the pesticide Roundup because they developed a way to insert a gene into crops that would allow them to spray their pesticide on it and increase yields. So they bought us as part of some vision of theirs and put us together with some different things. And in one of those processes, I got relocated to St. Louis, where headquarters are. And I started my MBA because it seemed like a good thing to do. So, I enrolled in that program, and in the middle of it, they informed me that I was going to lose my job. And they shut down my department, and it's one of those things. It happened on my wedding anniversary. My wedding anniversary happens to be September 11th. So this was September 11th, 2000. And so I got to sit at my anniversary dinner and tell my wife I was going to lose my job. And I started to tell her, here's my plan. We'll do this with it. And basically, we decided we would stay in St. Louis and that I should be looking for a job. And I was totally happy with that. And then a couple months later, we had an elective in my MBA program where I took an entrepreneurship class.
Mhm.
I forgot. One day when I was working at Kelco, I got a call from somebody who said we needed to sell xanthan gum to people with swallowing problems, with dysphagia. And I had no idea what it was. And I asked her why we needed to do this. And she gave me this story where her mother was in hospice care and her mother had refused to drink the cornstarch thickeners.
Yeah.
And so she had been at work telling people about this. And they said, well, maybe you should try our xanthan gum because, what do you have to lose? So she took home some xanthan gum. They told her how to mix it in a blender. And she felt like xanthan gum gave her more time with her mother. And so
Mhm.
this was one of those ideas. She called me, like product development. We should do this. And it was a great idea, but it was not a good idea for us. We're the world's largest xanthan manufacturer. We want to put things in bigger packages. We want to sell them by the rail car. We want to put them in 3,000 pound bags instead of 2,000 pound bags. Putting them in small containers and selling them to consumers was not our business model. And so
Yeah.
it's like, oh, but it's such a good story. I wish, there was a way to do that. I have my entrepreneurship class and I walked in and we needed to have an idea to pitch. And I walked in and said, hey, let's make a better thickener for people with dysphagia. And what we're going to do is we're going to make a liquid xanthan gum and it's going to be great. And it's not going to have all these problems of powder. And none of my classmates knew what I was talking about, but they all knew I was the one without a job and I had an idea. They figured if they picked my idea, I'd do all the homework.
This is like the ultimate group project.
So you understand group project dynamics.
Yes.
So then my professor came to me and said, hey, John, what do speech therapists think about your product? And I said, oh, they love it. And he said, well, how do you know that? And I said, this is a classroom project. Of course they're going to love it. And he said, no, no, no,
Don't
no,
do
no.
that wrong.
I think what you need to do, John, is you need to call up the local teaching hospital that is associated with our institution. You need to call them and say, hey, I'm a MBA student with a crazy idea. Can I come show you? And I was like, okay. I was more like, no, I'm not going to do that. And after a few times, I was like, okay, fine. I picked up the phone and I called the director of rehab over at big teaching hospital. I swear to you, the only time she ever picked up the phone the first time on the first call was that time when I called her. I was like, hey, dumb MBA student, can I come show you my crazy idea for a better thickener? And she said, yeah, sure. Come on Tuesday to our staff meeting. And I hung up the
Oh my
phone and I was
God.
like, oh no, I need a prototype. So I literally in my kitchen over the weekend put together a prototype. I ran around and found like little plastic bags and something called an impact sealer so I could seal little amounts in there. And I brought
Mhm.
it to the Tuesday staff meeting and I said, hey, John, silly MBA student, here's a crazy idea. We'll make a better thickener. And I demonstrated it for people and showed them. And then there was that deafening silence after you get done
Yes.
with it. And it was probably only a couple seconds, but it felt like, 3 hours. And then
Yeah.
all of a sudden, everybody got super excited. And they were like, oh my God, this is great. We're not going to have clumps. It thickens really well. And then they started asking me, does it work in this? Does it work in that? I'm like, yeah. It's fine. It's xanthan gum. It's going to work. And so that I went back to my professor and I said, see, I told you they loved it. It's great. And then he said, aren't a lot of your customers going to be nursing homes? Don't you need to talk to some people there? And I said, yeah, I guess so. So kind of the same thing. I talked to the people at the hospital. I said, do you know a nursing home? They said, yeah, here's a nursing home. And you know how you have a script going in your head? And so I look up their main number and I dial it and I say, and I'm like in my head going, okay, I'm going to ask for speech therapy. I'm going to ask for speech therapy. And the voice on the other end that answers the phone says speech therapy. And I didn't know what to do. So I went, ugh, and I hung up.
Yep.
So I went back to the phone book. I verified this is back in the days of a phone book.
I was ready to say those aren't even made anymore.
So I looked it up and I'm like, that's the number I called. So I dialed it again. And again, speech therapy. And I said, is this, such and such nursing home? And they said, yeah. And I said, oh. I thought I was calling the main number. And they said, oh, yeah, it's misprinted in the phone book. I said, okay, well, I wanted to talk to you anyway. And then, same thing, dumb MBA student, crazy idea. Can I come by and show you? And they were like, oh, yeah, sure. You have a better thickener. Come on over. Come over. I showed them and they're like, oh, my God, this is great.
Better.
You need to do it. And those two people actually volunteered their time, and I brought them down to ASHA in 2001 to help work our booth because they were so enthusiastic about it. So I had these institutions and people who were volunteering to help. I had my classmates, and we got to the final presentation, and then May of 2001 rolls around, and I'm graduating. I do have a job offer from a large company. My wife is 9 months pregnant, so we started SimplyThick on May 1st, and on May 15th, my daughter was born. And I think on like May 20th was like graduation. I remember this conversation with my wife as we went to pick up my daughter's pictures. And I said, there's this dysphagia thing that we can do, but it's a startup. And, my wife and I have been good squirrels our whole lives. We saved our money. I knew we'd be fine for a year or two, even if it crashed. And I said, we could do that, or I can take this big company job. I know what the big company job is. I know the ups and downs. I know the hours. I understand all that. There's going to be a lot of those jobs around, even if the company goes bad. I said, but what do we want to do? And basically, as I remember it, we decided that if I took the big company job, I'd always wonder about this dysphagia thing. And if I took the dysphagia job, I probably wouldn't ever wonder about the other company. And that's been pretty much true. So it was a decision both of us made. And I always want to emphasize that. It wasn't like I just decided to do this. It was me and my wife having this conversation. So I think we both have a high tolerance for risk.
Also have equal partnership and respect, which is just...
and I forgot to say, she quit her job to stay home too.
Yeah.
So 2001, May of 2001, we got rolling, and our whole target was to be at ASHA in November of that year. And we got product made and we showed up there. Actually, it got done so fast that we were able to launch at the equivalent to ASHA. The FNCE is how we say it. The FNCE, Food, Nutrition Conference and Expo, for the dietitians. That happened to be in St. Louis, Missouri that year. I think we got product delivered to us on like Thursday, and on Friday we made sample kits, and on Sunday the show started, but we could just drive there. So that's kind of how things came together, and that's how SimplyThick got started. And then, you fast forward to Friday, February 13th, 2015, and ASHA was in Denver, and I went down into the bowels of the Denver Convention Center to go hear this presentation on this weird thing I'd been hearing about called IDDSI. I wanted to get to the bottom of it, and I wanted to know what it was about because I didn't trust people. And I sat and it was a huge room. And I'm sure nowadays there's probably 500 people who say they were there because there was about 500 seats, but there was really about 20 or 30 of us in the audience. And Peter Lamb gave this presentation and explained IDDSI and showed the testing methods and all that kind of stuff. And my jaw just hit the ground, and I was like, this is magical. And this is going to be a game changer for our industry, because I'd spent 12 years arguing with people about how thick is thick. This was the number one discussion we had, how thick is thick, and why xanthan gum flowed different than starch, so it can have different flow characteristics, and why it's still okay, and all that kind of stuff, the technical discussions. And I walked out of there and I said, Peter, what do you need? We're here for you. We will do whatever we can to help you with this, because this is the right thing to do. So that's how I got on my IDDSI journey. And when I decided that I would be giving presentations and stuff, I designed a shirt so I could have an IDDSI shirt to wear at my presentations.
Yes. I would like to request an IDDSI sweatshirt, but with a black background and then the pictures popping off, just because it would match my coloring better.
It would match your coloring better. Okay.
Yes. Yes. I'll admit my vanity for 2 seconds there. But it has, on this side of the table, coming through, I went to grad school, finished grad. I started undergrad in 01 and started out as a speech teacher in the public schools for a few years before I went back and got my master's. So I didn't finish my master's until December of 09. But I was raised in the national dysphagia diet where is it pudding thick? Is it honey thick? Is it nectar thick? And working in the rural locations that I did, it was still the nurses were like, yes, but we don't want him to have honey. You don't want it to make it sweet like honey. I'm like, that's not what's happening right now. And so there's that. But to see the shift over to IDDSI, but also the consumer barriers on labeling, misunderstanding of dysphagia diet in national dysphagia diet to IDDSI, and not all locations using the current best practice model. It's been interesting to watch this, seeing as how it's 2024 and it should have been fully implemented and embraced, but different industries are struggling with the implementation and the rollout of the IDDSI program, even in some academic areas. But that's just a statement of fact.
It is a fact that the rollout has been much slower than any of us anticipated.
Mm-hmm.
And I think officially ASHA and ANFP and IDDSI and everybody targeted May 1st, 2019, if you can believe it, as the official rollout time.
Yep.
So we're 5 years into it. I think when I've heard people in implementation science talk, it can take something in the teens number of years for things to get from the lab to full practice. So
yes,
we're hoping to do a little bit better than that, but
yes,
that's been the thing. And I've learned a tremendous amount cooperation and teamwork and enthusiasm and just understanding that things are slow from the people involved with it. Peter Lamb has taught me a ton, and we're good friends and we help cheer each other up sometimes, but it's a process getting
yes.
it there. But overall, the goal of IDDSI and all of the input and what it is to take something as complicated as a dysphagia diet and to make it so it's consumer consumable so that people understand it, and to have testing methods. And like an example I always give is my daughter had very complicated wisdom teeth removal. And the surgeon comes in and like, I mean, she did it in the hospital and he was worried she was going to break her jaw. He comes in and says, well, I want her on a soft no chew diet. I said, what's a soft no chew diet? And he said, soft no chew. And I'm in this business, and I went and researched, and I was looking on the websites and stuff.
That's,
There's no good definition of that. Basically, if you ask me, it's a level 5 minced and moist. And that's what they should be doing, because minced and moist, you can do a little bit of chewing. It could be a puree, but mostly it's minced and moist. You can kind of gum it a little bit, and it's not fully there, but that's really what he wanted. And so to go from somewhere, and I know this stuff. So I had no problem making minced and moist food for my daughter. But I can't imagine what another parent's doing. I mean, maybe it's like a week of yogurt is what they end up getting, or 2 weeks of yogurt, because
it
what
hasn't
are
been
you going to do?
explained.
It
Yeah.
hasn't been explained. And so with IDDSI, you have this framework of, I mean, when you explain it to people, and I always say, this is the way I look at the food, is it's just mimicking the natural human chewing process. You take this regular food, you put it in your mouth, you start chewing. What are you going to do? First, you're going to break it down to a bite-sized piece. If you keep chewing and mixing it with saliva, now you're going to break it down to where it's almost ready to swallow. That's minced and moist. If I go to my mother-in-law and I say, I want something minced and moist, she knows what minced is and she knows what moist is. She can almost do that without any guidance from a framework.
Yeah.
And then if you keep chewing and you keep processing and you keep adding saliva, now you have a puree in your mouth. And now it's ready to swallow. That's what a puree is supposed to be. So when I talk to people about processing foods and things like that, it's like, well, sometimes we have to add moisture to it. I've had a dry piece of chicken. I need to add a lot of saliva to it. And when I'm eating and chewing, I'm always adding saliva to it. So the fact that I have to add some liquid to food to help get it to puree or minced and moist is not that surprising, because we're trying to mimic in the kitchen what your physical ability is, mimicking that natural chewing and swallowing process. And it's meant to be so intuitive to help people understand what you're looking for.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the brilliance of it. And then you take the simple test methods, which scientifically, I come from the world of rheology. I know what rheometers are. I know how to run those tests. I understand what their strengths and weaknesses are and things like that. I also understand that they're, even on the cheap end, they're like $5,000 instruments. Well, I haven't bought one in 15, 20 years, so probably $7,500 now. And in the kitchen, you would break it in 5 minutes
Yeah.
because people don't know what they're doing. And that's why I've always been, you can't do viscosity measurements. You can't do rheology. So then the simple flow test, it seems simple, but when you start thinking about the physics of it, the height of the column, how it changes over time, the papers they've written about all the different shear rates that occur in that nozzle, I mean, it it's kind of amazing, but it's super simple, and anybody can do it anywhere in the world.
And that is having worked in 2 different states, having gone from super inner cities to rural country to now
Mhm.
being up in the mountains in a valley, having worked in university clinics, all of the above, I can attest to that. And with y'all, with enough strategies and supports, you can uplift and pour into the caregivers that you don't think that are going to get it, but they'll get it. So one of the things that I've done clinically, and folks, I'm just giving you these strategies so that you have them. Take them. If you're already doing them, awesome. If you've got a better idea, then by all means message me. Tell me how to grow in my clinical practice. But one of the first things that I always do is I have a printed laminated copy of the picture of the pyramids for IDDSI. And I have them blown up so that they're larger so that I can sit down with my caregivers. And when we're going through, either if they're coming to me with a swallow study or if they're, if I'm working with them and sending them out for diagnostics or whatever, we can sit through and kind of analyze. You can have the syringes ready and handy, but also I always ask my caregivers to bring in their own materials, because what I have in my clinic is mine, but they have access to different resources and supports, and I want them to feel comfortable with the tools that they're bringing. And then we sit down and we go through it. And what I find is, now that I've moved, the larger hospital, not too far away, the larger children's hospital will send out IDDSI/National Dysphagia Diet documents. It'll say IDDSI first for recommendations and then slash it with NDD. Now, back in South Carolina, it was the reverse. Prisma in Columbia, which was, Prisma Children's Hospital, they always did National Dysphagia Diet. And it wasn't until the last year or two that they started giving IDDSI recommendations in secondary. Versus if our children were seen at MUSC, they would come with IDDSI recommendations. And some of the clinics had even removed the national. So it's this swing of where are we? And then having that health literacy piece, when I get the patient on a week-to-week basis, having the ability to hold those meaningful conversations, having the ability to do an in-depth routines-based interview with the caregiver. How is this working? What did you understand? What barrier did you have this week? And maybe not necessarily in those like technical words, but making sure I'm meeting them where they are. And sometimes it's just as they didn't know how to meal prep. They didn't know how to, they were worried about trying a pureed food because maybe the toddler or the baby label said one thing, but did it jive with this recommendation? And when I have older children, like I have some upper elementary, middle school age kids on my caseload, but they're have significant past medical history. So developmentally,
Mhm.
we're a little behind. Meeting them where they are, and their needs are so different, but it's just creating the environment and space for them to ask the questions, and then having the tools like the visuals ready to roll and to be able to say, hey, check out this link, hey, check out this video. And on that note, not all videos are accurate. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Yeah, make sure that you fact check your reviews. Okay, but you talked about rheology. That's the study of fluid movement, right? Or did I
Yes.
totally screw that up?
Yes. So when it comes to rheology and thickening and things like that, the first thing you need to know is that when I got a C, or was it C minus or whatever, in my fluid mechanics class in college, I thought, awesome, I'm done with that. I will never have to deal with that again. Um,
Famous last words.
famous last words.
Uh-huh.
So when you take a step back, rheology is the study of how fluids move. And then everybody wants to know what's viscosity. And very short, simple way is that viscosity is how thick something is. The more technical thing is that when you take, I think it's, you take a plate 1 meter square, 1 meter apart, and you have it moving at 1 meter a second. And that's how we come across the whole theory of thickness and flow rates and shear rates. And it all has to do with, I mean, if you think about it, when fluids are flowing or pouring on a cup or something, at that edge of the cup or the pipe is how we think about it in engineering, it's not really moving. And in the middle, it's moving as fast. And so you have that gradient of different flow rates, which turns into shear rates, which is it. And it gets very, very complicated. And there's lots of very deep formulas and things like that. And the things that I always learned is that viscosity is a number that depends on how you measured it, all of the conditions you put it under, temperature, the shear rate, the equipment you measured it on sometimes, and then that's just your shear viscosity. Then there's other things. I always like to talk about extensional viscosity because it's kind of fun. And, with your kids, you can talk about extensional viscosity because that's kind of how stringy something is. And so you start thinking about certain
Laffy
body
Taffy.
fluids or Laffy Taffy. Saliva can be thick or it can be thinner. Snot can be very stringy. I,
I
the,
work with toddlers. There's so much snot. Like there's so many boogers.
yep, yep.
Yeah.
And there are serious scientific papers written about this where there are machines, put a liquid in between two plates, pull it apart and see how much resistance it is to it. That's called extensional viscosity. So
That's
like
gross.
we worked with a polymer that I don't think it was ever commercialized really, but it had a high extensional viscosity. So it was really cool. It would like run up the spindle and it would fling out these big strings. But, you know, it, when you started talking extensional viscosity, you got way over people's heads.
No, all I can see is at our old house in South Carolina before we moved, there was no way I could get the stain off the ceiling. One time the boys pulled it too far back and it flew off the little flipper and there was like a red hand stuck to the ceiling and we got the hand down, but like there was like this murder print on the ceiling that was like a red stain. I'm like, it's fine. It's a bunch of frat boys that are moving in because actually, fun fact, a pediatrician bought our house for his college sons to live in, and they only lived half a block away from our house. And I was like, that's a lot of money. I don't understand that thought process, but they have a murder handprint with really good, was it elastic viscosity? Elastin?
That is extensional. How
Extensity.
thick is
Yes,
it in extension?
that's
And
great.
so you have all these different characteristics of fluids, and it really, like the simplest fluid, we always call it Newtonian fluids. That's like water. And
Okay.
that means that the viscosity doesn't change basically how you measure it.
Okay.
Most things are non-Newtonian fluids, meaning that they change depending on how much force you put on them. So when you look at the thickeners we use in our industry, and generally speaking, it's starches and it's xanthan gum, they have different reactions to forces in different ways. And they're both what we call pseudoplastic, meaning that when you put more force on them, they thin down.
Okay.
So xanthan gum is more pseudoplastic, so it can seem really thin when you look at it, but it's really thick when you put it in your mouth. That was the discussion I used to have with people because they were used to the visual of how starches behaved, and they would say, well, this isn't thick enough. And I'd say,
Yes.
well, it has more pseudoplasticity. So what you need to do is put it in your mouth because your eyes are deceiving you because the visual cues you're using aren't correct. And
Okay.
so when you're in the mouth, it's a lower shear activity. And when you go back and look at the National Dysphagia Diet, they tried to introduce some of these concepts. I can't particularly argue like they picked 50 reciprocal seconds. The general estimate of what the force is on swallowing is between 1 and 100 reciprocal seconds. That's the amount of shear or kind of the force that's put on it. And
Mhm.
so 50 is a good number in the middle. You can't really complain about that. And then you're talking about, well, we're going to measure it at one shear rate. And that's good. That's fine. That I can get behind that. So generally what they're trying to do with the National Dysphagia Diet was bring some of that in. The problems with it, if you really understood it, is that a centipoise is really kind of like a millimeter in terms of the sensitivity of measurement. Meaning, like if I measure something and you measure something in millimeters, we might be off by a couple. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just the natural variability. And you would look at some of the ranges in the National Dysphagia Diet, like I think SimplyThick went from 351 to 1750 centipoise. But if it was 350 centipoise, it was nectar. So you had that boundary of one
Yeah.
centipoise difference. And to me, that was non-distinguishable. But I can
Yeah.
guarantee you that a 351 centipoise and a 1740 would be very different fluids to us
Yes.
visually. So I kind of had, those were kind of my complaints about that. Plus, they measured everything at room temperature. And a lot of fluids have temperature sensitivity.
Yes.
And we never drink room temperature fluids.
No, that
But
tastes like spit. That's at room temperature water. I always thought just tastes like spit, and I've had plenty of patients tell me that as well. So having the little bit of flavor to it, or the chill or the warmth, gives more biofeedback, so they know where the liquid is in their mouth, and that can be a huge game changer in and of itself.
so when you put all of that together, and then you look at IDDSI, where it doesn't matter if it's hot or cold, you just run it on this thing, and what it cares about is at the point of service.
No.
You know, if you're going to serve, like, I never want to advocate people with swallowing problems getting served really hot coffee, for example. Warm
Mhm.
coffee, 120, 130, not as satisfying, but you got somebody who doesn't have the good coordination going on, it can hang out longer. We don't want to burn the tissue. So
Yep.
make something that's safe there. Have
Yep.
that flow the same, or something that's refrigerated flow the same. I can get behind that. Are there problems with it? Probably. Is it the best science in the world? Probably not, but that's not what we're going for. And that's the argument I've had with rheologists about IDDSI is I'm like, you're right. We could buy $100,000 pieces of equipment and we could test stuff in the lab. But at the end of the day, it's about a caregiver and a patient and making sure
Yes.
that that liquid you thicken is approximately right.
Yeah.
And the flow tester does that so well compared to all the other things that people have wanted to do over the years. And I understand the draw of trying to do more scientific things, but like I said, at the end of the day, it's about sitting there with the patient and a
Yes.
caregiver. So that's what I like about it. I've used expensive equipment to measure things. I probably have $15,000 worth of viscosity equipment in my labs that I haven't used in 7 or 8 years now because of IDDSI.
I would like to say I could say the same, but I probably have the equivalent of that in yarn in the other room.
Yarn is more useful.
Fun.
So when you measure viscosity in a lab in college, we would measure the time it takes something to flow. You would put it in a water bath, you measure how long it takes to flow. That's one way. Usually the way that these fancy viscometers are built is that they're going to have a controlled geometry and a controlled speed. You can run all of your calculus equations and determine the viscosity. And you want to run it at different temperatures, you want to run it at different shear rates, and you can get all that kind of stuff. So they're fascinating pieces of equipment, but they're very sensitive to the conditions that you run them in.
Yeah.
And viscosity changes a lot depending on how you measure it. People want viscosity to be a really firm number, but it's not. It's just sort of an indication of how it behaves in that particular set of conditions. Then there's the most fun piece of fluid is something called shear thickening, meaning when you put more force on it, it gets thicker. That is something that's what quicksand is, honestly. So that when you have quicksand, you sink because you're not moving. And then when you try to move, it resists your movement. And there's actually a YouTube video on my personal YouTube channel from 20 years ago where I decided to demonstrate this with my kids one day. And we put 100 pounds of starch into a bucket
Uh-huh.
and I jump up and down on that and show people how you can stand on it. But then as soon as you stop like dancing on it, then you sink because you stop
Okay.
putting force on it.
This morning on our walk, because the boys and I take a walk every morning, do about a
Uh-huh.
mile, maybe 2 miles, and I was talking about things that anticipated encountering as a small child that I have yet to have to, like, fight off, like stop, drop, and roll. Quicksand was up there. Like, that was embedded in a lot of Calvin and Hobbes and cartoons, and
Yep.
I really thought I would encounter that. So the fact that you then brought it up today is rather perfectly timed because it was one
Yes.
of the things that I thought I would run into a lot more, and knock on wood, have yet to encounter quicksand on a hike.
You you probably have run into quicksand in the smallest sense because where you
Oh,
see it, but it's not deep, so you don't sink very far. But all of us have been on the edge of the water at
yes,
the beach or whatever, and you feel how hard it is to pull your feet up sometimes.
yes,
That's what we're talking about. And basically, what you have is a situation where all of these sand particles or swollen particles, they have just a little layer of water around them. And when you try to move, it doesn't have time for the water to move and allow them to flow. So they kind of stick together. And
oh,
that's what you see. And so we've all experienced it in the micro sense at the edge of the lake or at the water. Most of us mercifully have not run into like a 10-foot pit
yes.
of quicksand where, if you move, you sink. And if you try to move, you get worn out because it's resisting your movement. So you got to move really slowly.
Or have Indiana Jones rescue you because let's be
Exactly.
honest, that's every girl's dream.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. All right. So this gets me back to, but how did you make it work from the patient perspective of I can reach my hand in the fridge and pull out a chilled, like pre-thickened cranberry juice or something like that, and the viscosity isn't going to change as they swallow it? And how does it not cause major constipation issues downstream?
Okay. Part of what you're thinking is not true. It does
Okay.
change all thickeners. It's going to change between when it's sitting there and when you swallow it because you're putting different forces on it. What we're trying to do is make sure that this is my simple, I'm not a speech therapist type of way of visualizing what we're doing. We're going to put something in the mouth. We want it to be cohesive enough so that we can control it, form a bolus, and then when we propel it, it's going to stay together. I mean, there's not a lot of
Mhm.
force on it when it's in your mouth and you're trying to organize that bolus. And when you
Mhm.
push it through, you're putting a completely different amount of force on it. So
Mhm.
the fluid is going to react differently in each of those situations. And what we've figured out with the thickeners is that in general, it allows it to have that cohesiveness and to stick together as you swallow it as a bolus.
Mhm.
So you need enough thickness when you're swallowing it. A lot of thickeners don't break down and they're just soluble fiber. And if you talk to dietitians in America, we don't have enough fiber in our diet anyway. So it's all good. What it does is it holds more moisture into the stool. So it tends to be softer. If you have a lot of fiber in your diet, it may be looser. And sometimes that's mistaken for diarrhea, which is much more of a flushing of the system. But
Mhm.
fiber in general is generally considered a good thing because it helps um, things move through your system and helps create the proper bulk in your stool.
Yes.
Starches are actually digested, so they don't provide the fiber. But the xanthan gum, which our product uses, and carabine gum, I believe, pass through as fiber because they're non-digestible, large molecules. Uh, xanthan gum is basically cellulose backbone, which
Okay.
is cotton, right? That's cellulose backbone, and we don't have the enzymes to break that down. And then xanthan gum has trisaccharide side chains on it that make it soluble. And it is a molecule that was discovered in the 1950s, growing on a cabbage leaf. A
Growing on a cabbage leaf?
Yeah, yep.
Have you read 12 Molecules That Changed the Course of History? It
I
was
have not.
it's also known as Napoleon's 10 Buttons. Highly recommend it.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll have to look into that. But
Yes.
I think the USDA discovered it and isolated it. It was a bacteria that was growing, and it produces this exocellular molecule, meaning outside of its body, to protect it and to help hold moisture in. And then they isolated it, and they figured out that it would be a good thickener. And then it was commercialized by the company I used to work for, Kelco, back in the 60s, and it got food approval in 1969.
What
And so
color is it in its pure natural state? Is it white then?
it's kind of an off-white powder.
Okay.
It's a little tan is probably the best way to describe it. And basically what they do is they grow 20,000 gallon fermenters full of this bacteria, and the bacteria is producing the gum. Then they pasteurize it to kill the bacteria, and then it's about recovering the xanthan gum, which they do with an alcohol precipitation. They generally use isopropyl alcohol,
Okay.
but ethanol has been used too. You get a precipitate, which turns into a white fiber. All of the large molecules come out, and then the small debris and things like that don't come out in the precipitation reaction. And then they purify that, and then they dry it down.
What happened?
So the internet happened.
I think it's because we're in the valley in the mountains, and that probably has a lot to do with it. Okay, you were full blown midstream, and I was thinking of all of the constipation patients that I see. I have a large quantity of pictures of other people's fecal matter texted to me by their parents. Wow. And I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, we should definitely share that with the GI at your upcoming visit. Because, yeah, poop shouldn't be iridescent.
I can agree with that one.
Yeah. But so do you ever get concerns or complaints of SimplyThick causing constipation? Because it sounds like from a very cellular chemical process, no, it would actually assist with.
Well, we get, in the last time we looked, it was basically 50-50.
Okay.
People saying that they thought it caused diarrhea, and people who thought that it caused constipation. And, we get not dozens of comments a year like that. It's, maybe one a month, maybe not. It's very rare, but we do hear both sides of it. I understand there are some people who are quite sensitive to xanthan gum, so they shouldn't use it.
Yeah.
If you find in your system that it's not going well, then don't use it. They're
Yeah,
out
that's
there.
to be said for all medical products.
And most foods too.
I love dairy. The feeling is not mutual. And then I see that instead of it being the food pyramid, we now have the My Plate, and they've actually removed the milk carton and recommend dairy. But when you actually go through the pages, it'll say, or other vitamin D rich product. I'm like, well, at least they're going that route, because Happy Indigenous People Day, I'm a member of the Potawatomi tribe. We were literally not designed to process dairy. Like, that's not going to happen for my GI tract. Doesn't stop me from eating cheese, though. Oh, well.
Yep. And so we've gotten better at recognizing those different individual issues and embracing them and helping people deal with them.
Yes.
My family has a long tattered history with gluten. And in the early 90s, if you can imagine, my mother was told that she was gluten sensitive.
Wow.
And she should avoid it. Or not gluten sensitive, intolerant. Back in the early 90s, if you told somebody you couldn't eat gluten, they had no idea what you meant. And then like 18 months ago, 2 years ago, we found out my son is celiac. So, and then it turned out 3 of the 5 members of the family are celiac. So we've redone our entire diet, and you find it very accommodating to go out in the world. And, there's a lot of waiters and waitresses and a lot of chefs that totally understand it and will accommodate you. 30 years ago, that would have been crazy.
So that begs the question, couple of different thoughts, and this is just me speaking positivity into the universe, like what we can do to make things easier. One, on the SNAP and WIC benefits, unfortunately, not all SNAP and WIC beneficiaries can it doesn't align with their unique needs. So, like, I have patients on my
Hmm.
caseloads that do have celiac disease, or they have FPIES, or food protein induced enterocolitis, or they may have, insert whatever it is. But nationally, gluten-free foods or some of those foods don't exist on those approved supplemental benefits. But also for our children that require thickener, it's not a guarantee that insurance is going to pay for it. I have one little guy on my caseload who, bless his heart, he's got dysphagia. They've done a ton of testing. He's almost 3. And we don't have a known etiology for the dysphagia yet, which is kind of wild because we've done a scope, we've done a swallow study, and they still can't figure out the actual structural cause. I thought for sure it was going to be a laryngeal cleft, and it wasn't. Me and the NT were just like, what is happening? But trying to get his insurance to approve, as it would be SimplyThick, has been very challenging for the mother, myself, and their own Medicaid case manager. So it begs the question, big picture, what steps can we, and I mean, don't have to have an answer, but what step can we as professionals advocate for these systemic changes? Because those are huge top-down changes that then positively impact the tiny humans or not so tiny humans that we're called to serve. I don't know. These are the things that keep me awake at night.
I don't know a good answer for all of that because Medicaid in particular is a state
I
by
know.
state program. So that's where you start going, well, you got to work with the local legislature so that they'll fund it. We've seen different states have different approaches to those type of things. So I'm aware that there's some states that are very generous with thickener because they recognize the need, and there's other states where they're not. And I've always just kind of assumed that it just depended on who in the legislature has personal experience.
And their state associations and whether or not they have practitioners that
Yeah.
currently understand and know it. Guys, this is why you join your state association.
Yes. Because I understand their logic is that, well, thickeners are considered food. And what thickeners are doing is they're doing their ordinary thing. They're thickening things. So it's not even considered a special transformation.
Mhm.
And so, like, well, it's just food. It's just a different food you need to buy.
Yep.
I can see that argument, but on the other hand, we all know that there's a medical necessity behind
Mhm.
it, and it's doing things that just improve the quality of life so
Yep.
much
I
that you'd like to see it
I
covered.
had one of the folks at the Medicaid company, whichever branch Medicaid, informed me. She was like, "Well, can't you just use cereal or something?" I was like, "No, ma'am, we cannot just use cereal for this small child. Like, that's not clinically appropriate for a lot of reasons." And she was like, "Oh, well, I guess she had like a script or a prompt that she just had to go through."
So it often takes very dedicated people to talk to the right people in the
Mhm.
organization. We've seen some, when the right people get involved, that they can get some movement forward with Medicaid programs in different
Mhm.
states.
Mhm.
And again, it's like you're saying, when you get involved with your state or association and they make it a target and they target the right people, they can make a
Mhm.
difference.
Okay, I have a calendar that is from May of last year, but it has all of my thoughts on it. So I can't change the page because it's
Uh-oh.
got all of my thoughts for essentially the last 18 months written down here on one shape or form. So it has been added to May 17th, which was a Thursday, just as a heads up. But
Okay.
okay, so we have covered so very much, and I'm trying to be conscientious of our time because I think we only have like 5 minutes left. But in our last 5 minutes, what do you wish speech pathologists knew about thickening, about, I mean, all of the above? Like, what do you wish we knew either to do our jobs more efficiently or to pour into caregivers and or patients to build them up, and give them a more secure footing?
That is
Very
a
big question.
that is a tough question.
Through the magic of
Um,
editing, it will come across very smooth.
I really wish everybody would understand that ITSE is really getting us all in the common terminology, and the common language is going to be a great first step. There's a lot of research out there, and we've seen things like in the UK last year, the Royal College of Speech Language Therapy put out a position paper basically saying we shouldn't thicken at all. ITSE finally gives us the tools to cure a lot of the defects in the research, because almost every study I've ever read, they're using some kind of thickener, and I can look at every speech therapist, look them in the eye and say, so do you believe they thickened everything consistently for the entire study period? And there's not a person that's ever looked at me and said, yes, I believe
Mhm.
that. I'm just saying you have to be suspicious of it a little
Mhm.
bit because of the inconsistencies of the way things have been thickened over the
Yes.
years. ITSE finally puts tools into our hands where we can begin to be somewhat confident that caregivers are giving people things
Mhm.
consistently. And I'm kind of hopeful that the research is going to, once we get this, and not just liquids, but on the food side as well, that we start getting some consistent processing of foods and presentation of foods and liquids, that we're going to start to see some of the real benefits of these diets and all of the work that we're all doing.
Mhm.
Because I know that you guys don't want to tell somebody they need to go on moderately thick liquids unless they really have to, but helping people understand why they do that and help them understand they're only going to get moderately thick, not extremely thick. You know, let's give them what they need. And so that's what I always, that's why I fell in love with ITSE, because I finally saw a way where everybody could be confident that they're making stuff the right way and that there's going to be consistency in what we're serving over time. And it also gives you the tools. You know, there's products out there that don't thicken super fast.
Mhm.
It gives you the tools to know how long you need to
Yes.
wait. And it's going to vary with different liquids. We all think of food as food. A scientist looks at it and says, you know, those are very different environments that you're putting things in. You got hot, you got cold, you got low pH, you got moderate pH. We don't really drink a lot of liquids that are alkaline. Milk is, you know, a little bit alkaline, but not that
Mhm.
much. But to a scientist and to a thickener, those are very different environments. And then you have different amounts of solids, you have different other molecules that are present. And so getting things to thicken consistently, there's a lot of art to it as well as the science to get it right. That's why you'll see on powders, there's a variety, there's a range of amount to be added because it's going to depend on a lot of different factors. So that's what I hope people understand, is that we're putting the tools in your hands so that we can actually successfully deliver to the patient what's needed,
Yes.
and that we will begin to see the benefits that we've all kind of intuitively believe are there, but we haven't had the good data to back us up
Yes.
on that.
Because everybody's speaking the same language. So,
Well, everybody's speaking the language and we have tools
yes.
now. Because if I tell you you need to run a viscometer and make sure that it's 350 centipoise at 50 reciprocal supplicants at room temperature, that doesn't mean a lot. But if I say you need to run it on your flow tester and get between 4 and 8 milliliters left behind, everybody knows how to do that.
Yeah, I can do that in the mess hall at work. The kitchen at work, we call the mess hall. I can do that in the mess hall.
Yep.
The other, I would just stare like a sheep and be like, yup, what he said. Just go on about it. Yep.
Yep. Yep. And so that's what I see the potential of ITSE as being. And you know, that's why I've become such a passionate advocate of it and helping people understand it and talking about it and doing presentations and webinars and social media videos and all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. All of it was just born of the passion and the understanding that ITSE finally unlocks the tools we need to do this consistently.
What resources, because I know you've made a ton of videos, what resources are there available for folks if they want to learn more, if they want to teach a caregiver, or if they have a grad student with them and they want to give the grad student an opportunity to learn? Where would you send them?
So I always send people to itsy.org. And when you scroll down to the bottom of the page, there's these things called reference groups. And we have a US reference group, we have a Canada reference group that I participate with. But there's other English language ones, or if you're bilingual, look at the other
Mhm.
ones. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of people around the globe producing resources. A lot of What the reference groups are doing is making things that are more locally sensitive. Some of the IDDSI documents, you'll see like they use British spellings of
Yes.
words. And so,
Because the standardization, whenever I go to spell it, I have to say it out loud in order to write it down correctly.
yep. So they have created documents where they've just taken terms that mean something to other people. Like we don't talk about pips and bits here in the US. They take some of that out. So they make the US version. In the US, they've created presentations for you to share with your administrator. How do you get them on board with IDDSI? They've put together other presentations. So those resources are there. I also tell people that what happened during the pandemic was I had 20 people sitting at home who couldn't go to facilities and couldn't visit places. And so they were working on rewriting our recipes into IDDSI format. And what we discovered in there was a series of techniques. I'm not going to say we have the best techniques or the only technique. We just discovered a series of techniques for how to process food into IDDSI compliant diets. And what we did is we said, let's put it together in a cookbook. And I used the caregiver. The caregiver I used in my mind was my mother-in-law, because my mother-in-law always cooks for people. That's a way she shows her love. If a family member of hers had dysphagia, told she needed to make minced and moist food, she doesn't need to know how to cook. I don't need to give her a cookbook and say, here's how you start with raw chicken, here's how you cook it, and here's what you do. She needs to be able to say, well, here's the chicken I made. How do I make it safe for my loved one? And so we put that together in a cookbook called Modern Dysphagia Cooking, with her in mind, written, where we put in the IDDSI diet. We had a dietitian teach the techniques that we use in facilities to sneak in calories and things like that, and to just show how to process these foods. It starts with you know how to cook, and we're just going to show you how to process them into dysphagia IDDSI. So it has IDDSI incorporated into it. The recipes are designed to show them how to do it. It can seem tedious because somebody like my mother-in-law wants a recipe for turkey and for chicken, and even though it's exactly the same instructions, I could hand them one sheet of paper and say, here's how to do it. We broke it out for them into each of the different recipes so that they can say, well, here I have chicken. And then it allows things like, this is my favorite example. When I have a barbecued pulled pork sandwich, I'm really having barbecue sauce with a little bit of meat in it. And when my wife has a pulled pork sandwich, she has a lot of pork with a little bit of barbecue sauce on top of it. So the techniques in the cookbook allow you to, when you make it for me, just use that barbecue sauce. Just use that to moisten the mince. When you make it for my wife, take something like chicken stock, thicken it to extremely thick, put that in there, and it moistens it, and then you put a little barbecue sauce on top. So you can customize it to the tastes of the individual, and that's gives you the flexibility. But those are kind of the resources, both for somebody who really wants to learn a lot.
Yes. I love, love, love this idea and the cookbook. It is, folks, as somebody who loves to cook, and my love language is I'm always cooking or baking, or you show up at my house, I will feed you, a drink will be poured. This is how I show love, because it's my grandma raised me and that's how she showed love.
Yep.
It is, I highly recommend y'all check it out. Also, if you are teaching the dysphagia class or the peds dysphagia class nearby college or university, I would recommend that you incorporate that into an assignment, because I do every year. Every year I have my grad students I give them a couple of different samples or case scenarios, and then ask them to create the meal as if they were the caregiver. The empathy, understanding, and patience that they have to show grows exponentially. As one of them told me, don't worry. She said, don't worry, Ms. Dawson, I've got Grubhub. And I was like, okay. So,
I guess that's the next version, right?
yeah.
How to process your Grubhub into dysphagia-friendly foods.
I was like, all right, cool, honey. Just making sure that you're nourished, baby. Let me mother you a little bit. But okay. All right. To be respectful of our time, one, thank you so much for coming on. I have so enjoyed this.
Yeah.
And two,
Not a
If
problem.
somebody wants to reach out from you or learn from you, how could they contact you, learn from you, shadow you? What's your Instagram handle? Lay all of the info on us, please, sir.
The stuff where you get the IDDSI training and information on thickening things and stuff like that, it's on TikTok and Instagram, and that's SimplyThick
Simply
John.
Thick John.
And
I love it.
yep, on my personal stuff,
It's
much of the educational part of it. About 2.5 years ago, I started. My goal was in 90 days to show that nobody cared about social media videos showing how to thicken things, and in 30 or 40 days, I was proved wrong. So I try to post one video a day, either about how to make a food or how to thicken a liquid, even just covering some of the things like I have videos on here's what minced and moist is, here's what pureed is. And the joy of the algorithm is that, yes, I have a huge back catalog, but nobody gets to see it. So I just have to keep producing it over and over again.
yes. It always captures somebody. The right person will find it
It
at the
does.
right time
It
because
does.
that's the beauty of faith.
Yep. And the other resource everybody should put on their calendar is that there should be another US IDDSI festival next July in Southern California.
July in Southern California.
Yep. We don't have the dates solidified,
Well,
but kind of the middle of July next summer in Southern California. But when we get the dates set, we'll let people know.
and then let me know because I would love to host a panel discussion. You pick the people and we could host them in May. That would give folks time to get flights and all of that and tease out the conference.
Yep.
Awesome. Oh, yay. Okay. John, thank you.
Oh, thanks, Michelle. Crazy.
Oh, thank you.
And time zones. So yeah.
Everybody that's in a different time zone, we always do this, but I got to say the one trying to cover Memory, Me, and Jean, because those were Central and Eastern didn't too bad, but pulling in the Australia one, that was a little tricksy.
Yes.
Folks, if you're listening, please take a peek on First Bite Instagram on podcast, First Bite Podcast on Instagram, also on Facebook. And if you ever have a recommendation for a topic or a speaker, please be sure to message us through there because oftentimes that's how these crucial conversations come about. So as always, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.